Modern SLR cameras typically have a number of different exposure modes that we can select from. These settings can bias our exposure depending on the subjects and the conditions we're shooting in. I'm not sure if I really should admit this, but in 20 years of using a digital SLR, I've never altered these settings at all. All my photography is done using evaluating metering, and I will say a few words why at the end of this presentation. Like many other settings on our camera, these are designed to be quick and easy to change. So you're most likely to find these controls on the body of your camera, and our particular SLR selects each option via a touch of the button and then a turn of the wheel near the shutter button. Now once we hit the button and turn the wheel, we can see the metering modes change on that little top plate there, but it's rather small, so let me enlarge it just a little bit. The symbol we're looking at as we change the metering modes is this one here. And this one is called evaluative metering. Now this is an all-round metering system which is good for the majority of the subjects we shoot, and it's probably the default setting on your camera. As I scroll through my options, the next one for me is partial metering, and it's identified by the symbol you can see there. This is more effective when the background is much brighter than our subject. Backlit scenes would be a good example, and here the exposure reads the light from approximately 10% of the subject around the center of the viewfinder. Spot metering is the next option, and it's usually shown like this, and we would use this for making an exposure of a specific part of the scene or subject. Here the exposure meter is weighted to about 4% of the scene around the center of the viewfinder. Portraits perhaps, where exposure on the face is important. The center weighted average option shown on screen here is weighted in the center but averaged for the rest of the viewfinder. Now you can probably appreciate that it's a good idea to keep your instruction book in your camera bag. There's nothing worse than pressing buttons in a random way to find these settings, but they should and are pretty clearly marked on the body of our camera. As I've already said, I've never used anything but evaluative metering, and I get along fine, but it will depend, I think, on your style and type of photography. I've shot 4 images using each of the metering options, and while this is not a real scientific test because all of these images were shot in the same conditions, it won't take long to go through them. The first one here, as you can see, I put the symbol up on the right hand side, is evaluative metering, good for the majority of the subjects we shoot. Next is partial metering. This is more effective when the background is much brighter than our subject. Spot metering for making an exposure of a specific part of the scene or subject. And center weighted average is weighted to the center but averaged for the rest of the viewfinder. I'd like to share 4 quick thoughts to end this video. If you're enthusiastic enough to be watching these videos, you really should be shooting raw images. So you may want to see our video on that subject if you haven't already done so. Raw files have so much exposure latitude these days that in all but the most exceptional circumstances, that raw exposure latitude will bridge any exposure gap between the settings we've just looked at. Secondly, if and when you need to change from evaluative metering, you're likely to know yourself, and you're unlikely to need a tutorial or guidance to help. Thirdly, for the meantime, just stay with evaluative metering, but just be aware that other options are available. And fourthly, we have an LCD screen on the back of our camera and histograms to help us get the exposure as good as possible anyway.